Ethan Walker hadn't expected one car ride to occupy so much space in his mind, yet the next morning he found himself replaying small moments, Zuri's soft laugh, the calm assurance in her eyes, the way she spoke as if she understood things he didn't say out loud. He had known her for less than an hour, but her presence lingered like a melody that refused to fade. That he checked his phone out of habit, though he knew he didn't have her number. A small disappointment pressed against him, ridiculous but real. He slipped the phone back into his pocket and walked toward the college gates with footsteps heavier than usual. Classes moved slowly that day. His mind wandered during lectures, drifting between notes on graphic design principles and fragments of the conversation he'd shared with her. By noon, his friend Logan Pierce noticed his distraction. Logan was loud, sharp-witted, and the type who enjoyed pointing out anything unusual. "You look like someone replaced your brain with a blank sheet of paper," Logan muttered while unwrapping his sandwich. Ethan forced a smile. "Just tired." "Or thinking about something," Logan countered, raising an eyebrow. Ethan offered no explanation. He wasn't ready to share yesterday's encounter. It felt too new, too fragile, like telling someone would make it disappear. Logan shrugged and dropped the subject, filling the silence with pointless commentary that Ethan barely absorbed. By the end of the day, Ethan mentally prepared himself for the long walk home. The thought exhausted him, but he tried to accept it. He stepped out of the main gate and instinctively glanced toward the roadside. A part of him hoped to see familiar headlights even though logic told him it was unrealistic. Then he saw her. Zuri stood beside her car, leaning casually against the door, arms crossed and a quiet smile playing on her lips. She looked like someone who had been waiting without impatience. Ethan froze. What are you doing here?" "Taking the long route home again," Zuri said. "Coincidentally, it passes right through here." "Coincidentally?" "Conveniently," she corrected, amusement flickering in her eyes. "Want a ride?" He didn't hesitate this time. "Yeah. I do." He slid into the passenger seat with more ease than before. The scent of mint and vanilla still filled the space. Zuri started the engine, and the warmth of familiarity settled between them, not overwhelming, but steady. "How was your day?" she asked, chaotic. "Yours?" "Surprisingly calm," she replied. "Helps when the weather behaves and customers don't decide to turn dramatic." Ethan chuckled. "You work in customer service?" "Technically," she answered. "I help manage shift rotations at a local cafe. The job is simple, the people aren't." There was something about the way she spoke, measured, gentle, but edged with humor. Ethan found himself relaxing, his shoulders dropping from their rigid tension. They talked again, but this time the conversation drifted deeper without forcing itself. Ethan mentioned his struggles with group presentations, how he felt out of place around people who always seemed more confident than him. Zuri listened without interrupting, nodding occasionally in a way that made him feel heard rather than analyzed. When the light turned red, she looked at him properly. "You're harder on yourself than you need to be." Ethan looked away, unprepared for the sincerity in her voice. I don't want to disappoint anyone." "Who are you trying so hard to impress?" He didn't answer. The question nudged at something buried, something he wasn't ready to examine. Instead, he shifted the conversation. "What about you? You seem like someone who always knows what she's doing." Zuri let out a soft laugh. "I wish. I just pretend well. Life feels easier when you walk like you know where you're going, even if the truth is blurry." Ethan considered her words carefully. "That sounds exhausting." "Sometimes," she admitted. "But I'd rather carry a burden than let it crush me." The honesty surprised him. Zuri had an aura of control, but hearing her vulnerability made her feel even more real, more human. Minutes passed without dialogue, but the silence was comfortable, textured with unspoken thoughts instead of awkwardness. When Zuri finally parked near a small lakeside overlook, a place Ethan had never visited before, he turned to her in confusion. "You said you were taking me home," he said. "I am," she replied. "But this is on the way. And I thought maybe you needed fresh air more than four walls." Ethan opened the door and stepped out. The lake shimmered under a soft afternoon light, rippling with gentle waves that mirrored the quiet turmoil inside him. Zuri joined him, standing close enough to be felt but not touching. "You come here often?" he asked. "When I need to think," she replied. "Or when the world feels too loud?" Ethan nodded. "I get that." The wind pressed against his sleeves, cool and steady. For a moment, he felt suspended, caught between the simplicity of the moment and the complexity of emotions forming quietly inside him. "You're different today," Zuri said suddenly. "How?" "Quieter. But not in a bad way. More like you're trying to understand something." Ethan hesitated. "I don't know what I'm feeling. Or why." "You don't have to figure it out alone," she said softly. "Sometimes it's enough to let yourself feel without naming it." Her words settled into him like ripples spreading across water, slow, gentle, inevitable. A small notification buzzed in Ethan's pocket. He glanced at it. A message from someone he hadn't heard from in months, Caleb Hayes, a friend he once cared about more deeply than he ever admitted. Caleb had left abruptly, without explanation, and the unresolved emotion still lay buried like an unfinished chapter. The text was simple: "Hey. Haven't seen you in a while. Can we talk?" Ethan's chest tightened. Zuri noticed the shift in his expression but didn't pry. "You okay?" she asked. "Don't know." He slipped the phone back into his pocket. Zuri didn't ask again. She simply stood beside him, the silence between them turning heavier but not uncomfortable. Something had changed. Not just in him, but in the space that stretched between them, something delicate yet powerful, like the first crack in a closed door. As the wind rustled through the trees and the lake shimmered at their feet, Ethan realized the truth with quiet clarity. Whatever path he was on, it was no longer the same one he had walked yesterday, and it was leading him towards something he wasn't prepared for, but desperately wanted to understand. The moment lingered, unresolved yet full of promise, pulling him into a future he couldn't yet see. Ethan found himself returning to the studio more often than he had expected. Each visit was an internal negotiation between curiosity and caution, a silent tug-of-war he could neither fully explain nor resist. Yoga had become more than a practice, it was a doorway, and Dylan, unintentionally, perhaps, was the key. The room, with its gentle morning light spilling across wooden floors, now felt intimate in a way that made Ethan acutely aware of every breath he took. Dylan greeted him with the same warm smile, casual but deliberate, and Ethan felt the subtle pull of familiarity mixed with the thrill of secrecy. The way Dylan's eyes crinkled at the corners when he smiled, the gentle encouragement in his voice, and the calm precision of his movements created a magnetic tension that Ethan couldn't quite rationalize. During the sessions, Dylan would sometimes pause to adjust Ethan's posture, his hands brushing against Ethan's shoulders or guiding him into a stretch. Every touch was professional, deliberate, and yet the effect on Ethan was undeniable. It wasn't just the physical sensation, it was the weight of attention, the sense of being seen in a way that felt private, even in a crowded room. Ethan noticed the way Dylan's gaze lingered, subtle and fleeting, and he caught himself wondering if Lucas had ever truly noticed this side of him, the quiet vulnerability that Dylan seemed to recognize instantly. Outside the studio, life carried on with its usual rhythm, but Ethan's thoughts kept returning to Dylan. He found himself analyzing every word, every glance, every small interaction, replaying them in a loop that blurred the line between admiration, curiosity, and something more. The exercises on the sheet Dylan had given him became rituals he performed with meticulous attention, not just for improvement but to feel a connection to the instructor who had unexpectedly entered his life. One evening, as the studio emptied after class, Dylan lingered, adjusting mats and speaking quietly with a colleague. Ethan approached, feeling the familiar knot of anticipation in his stomach. "You've been consistent," Dylan said, finally noticing him. "That's good. Yoga isn't just physical, it's about presence. Awareness." His voice was calm, but Ethan felt layers beneath it, unspoken subtleties that made him acutely self-conscious. I'm trying," Ethan admitted, his words uneven. "I want to get it right." "You're already halfway there," Dylan said with a small, knowing smile. "You just need patience, with yourself, and with the process." Ethan nodded, but his mind was elsewhere. He wanted to ask questions, to probe the subtleties in Dylan's voice, to understand the way Dylan seemed to balance authority and warmth effortlessly. And yet, a hesitation lingered, a whisper reminding him that Dylan was his brother's friend, a boundary he wasn't sure he was willing or able to cross. As the days passed, Dylan began offering small suggestions beyond the studio walls, subtle adjustments to posture during daily routines, reminders to breathe when stressed, even casual advice about mindfulness during hectic moments. Each interaction, seemingly innocent, created a private dialogue that existed in parallel with the world outside. Ethan became increasingly aware of how much these moments meant, how much they stirred something unspoken, almost forbidden. At home, Ethan's reflections grew more complex. He thought about Lucas, about the casual mentions of Dylan's visits and jokes shared between the two men. There was a safety in the familial lens, a sense of normalcy that made Ethan's internal conflict sharper. He liked Dylan, it went beyond admiration or respect. There was a subtle magnetism, an emotional intensity he hadn't anticipated. Yet the thought of Lucas, of loyalty and family, lingered like a shadow, reminding him that this connection, however abstract, carried implications he couldn't ignore. One afternoon, during a particularly quiet session, Dylan approached him with a question about his breathing. "Ethan, notice how your chest rises before your abdomen. Try to let the movement start lower, more rooted." His voice was soft, almost intimate. Ethan followed the guidance, and the sensation of control and release swept through him, leaving him momentarily disoriented. "Better?" Dylan asked. "Yeah," Ethan breathed, heart unexpectedly quickened. "Much better." Dylan nodded, stepping back, but the subtle intensity in his eyes remained, and Ethan felt as though they had shared something private, unspoken, suspended in time. The tension was electric, not overt, but undeniable, a fragile thread that bound them in ways neither had fully acknowledged. Ethan's curiosity began to bleed into subtle observation. He noticed the way Dylan interacted with other students, gentle, attentive, professional, but somehow, when he was near, the tone shifted imperceptibly. There was a softness, a patience, a microcosm of attention that felt almost designed for him alone. Ethan questioned his own perception, telling himself he was overthinking, but the pull was relentless. Late one evening, after a session that stretched longer than usual, Ethan lingered by the mats, pretending to collect his bags slowly. Dylan was folding equipment at the far end of the studio. Ethan's pulse quickened as he realized he could speak without the watchful eyes of other students. "Dylan," he started, voice low, unsure. "Do you ever think about why people come to yoga? I mean, beyond the exercise?" Dylan paused, lifting his gaze. For a moment, the room seemed to shrink, the light soft and warm across the polished floors. "I think people come seeking clarity," he said slowly. "A way to connect, with themselves, with others, with something larger." "Why do you ask?" Ethan hesitated. He wanted to articulate the swirl of emotions, the strange pull, the subtle tension he could not name. Instead, he found himself nodding, murmuring, "I guess I'm still trying to find that." Dylan smiled faintly, a smile that was both reassuring and enigmatic. "You will. In your own time." The encounter ended without overt declarations, without crossing boundaries, but the effect lingered. Ethan walked home through the quiet city streets, the night air crisp and slightly sweet. He felt a strange exhilaration and unease intertwined, a recognition that something significant was unfolding, something he couldn't yet define but couldn't ignore. That night, lying awake, he traced the moments over and over, the subtle glances, the brush of hands, the unspoken understanding. It was a connection that existed in shadow, in nuance, in what was left unsaid. The tension wasn't dramatic or scandalous, not yet. It was emotional, psychological, a quiet gravity pulling him forward, towards something unknown, and as he drifted to sleep, Ethan realized with an odd clarity that the story was no longer about yoga, or even curiosity. It was about him, about discovery, and about a connection that promised to challenge everything he thought he knew about loyalty, desire, and identity. The journey had deepened, and with it came a fragile, thrilling anticipation. The following weeks unfolded quietly, as if the apartment itself held its breath. What had once felt like polite distance between Lucas and me began to soften into something warmer, something unspoken but persistent. The morning silences at the coffee maker turned into conversations that lingered too long. He'd ask about my day before it even began, and I found myself wanting to answer that we developed a rhythm that felt natural, too natural. He cooked dinner most nights, and I cleaned up afterward. Sometimes he'd stay in the kitchen with me, leaning against the counter, sleeves rolled up, voice low and unhurried. He'd tell small stories about his past, a childhood in Oregon, a brother he hadn't spoken to in years, a dream of one day owning a small cafe by the coast. His stories carried a melancholy that mirrored my own. One night, as I dried the last plate, I asked without thinking, "Do you ever get tired of being alone?" He smiled faintly, eyes focused on the dark window. "You stop noticing after a while," he said. Then, after a pause, "until someone reminds you what company feels like." I didn't know what to say, so I didn't. But something in his tone lingered, circling my thoughts long after I went to bed. Lucas had a way of filling the space between words with emotion. A brush of his hand, a glance across the room, each one carried more meaning than entire conversations. I told myself it was friendship, the kind of fragile connection two lonely people build to survive. But each day made the lie harder to maintain. It was late one evening when he mentioned Dylan. We were on the balcony, a bottle of red wine between us, the city lights flickering below. "I haven't been completely honest," he said, tracing the rim of his glass with a finger. The air grew still. "I'm still seeing someone. His name's Dylan. We've been together for years, but he travels a lot for work. Things have been complicated." I felt the ground shift under me. "Complicated how?" I asked, though part of me already knew that he sighed. "He's gone most of the time. When he's here, it feels like we're strangers sharing the same house. I guess I didn't realize how lonely I was until you moved in." I looked at him, heart thudding. His confession wasn't shocking, it only confirmed what I'd begun to suspect, but hearing it aloud made it real. It changed the way the air felt between us. "I'm not trying to make things messy," he added quickly, reading the hesitation on my face. "I just needed to tell you." The silence that followed was heavy and alive. I could hear the faint hum of traffic below, the whisper of wind against glass. I wanted to leave, to end the moment before it became something irreversible. But I stayed. That night, sleep wouldn't come. I lay awake listening to the faint sound of his footsteps in the hallway, the creak of floorboards, the closing of his door. My mind replayed his words again and again, each repetition threading guilt through the quiet longing I couldn't ignore. The next morning, I told myself to keep my distance. But distance is a fragile thing when you share walls and mornings. Days later, it was the heater that started it. My room's old radiator broke in the middle of an unusually cold night. I tried to fix it, but the metal hissed and rattled uselessly. Lucas knocked on my door, hair messy from sleep. "You'll freeze in here," he said. "Come stay in my room until it's fixed." I hesitated. "That's not necessary." "It's fine, Ethan," he said softly. "I'll take the couch if it makes you more comfortable." But when I stepped into his room, it was clear he hadn't meant it. The bed was wide enough for two, and the couch barely large enough for one. I told myself it was temporary, just one night that we lay there, a careful space between us, the glow from the streetlight cutting through the blinds. Neither of us spoke. I could hear his breathing, slow and steady, and my own heart, too loud in the quiet. Then, faintly, he whispered, "Do you ever wish things were simpler?" I turned my head. He was looking at me, eyes open in the dark. "Sometimes," I said. "But simple doesn't always mean right." He smiled sadly. "No. It doesn't." The space between us dissolved. His hand found mine under the blanket, hesitant at first, then sure. I didn't pull away. The touch felt inevitable, like gravity, slow, certain, unstoppable. When his lips met mine, the world shrank to the quiet pulse of breath and heartbeat. It wasn't rushed, not desperate, just two people stepping across a line they'd been pretending not to see. For a moment, everything felt right in the wrong way. Later, I lay awake, watching the faint light spill across his face. He looked peaceful, younger somehow. But guilt crept in, cold and certain. I had promised myself I wouldn't become part of someone else's betrayal, yet here I was, tracing the same painful outline. At dawn, I slipped out of bed, careful not to wake him. The apartment was hushed, the kind of stillness that follows after something irreversible. I made coffee, hands trembling slightly, and stared out the window as the sky turned pale. When Lucas entered the kitchen, he didn't speak. He just placed a hand on my shoulder, a silent acknowledgement of what we both already knew. His touch was warm, but it burned with consequence. That he finally said, "Dylan's coming back this weekend." I froze. The words landed heavy. "Does he know?" I asked. That he shook his head. "No. And I don't know what to do." For a long time, neither of us spoke. The coffee steamed between us, untouched. "I shouldn't have," I began, but he cut me off gently. "Don't," he said. "Last night was real. Even if it was wrong." I wanted to believe him, but the truth pressed hard against my chest. Real didn't make it right. The rest of the day passed like a half-remembered dream. I went through the motions, work, chores, quiet meals, but the air between us had changed. Every look, every word carried the weight of something forbidden. That night, as Lucas slept beside me again, I stared at the ceiling. I could feel the warmth of him, close enough to touch, close enough to destroy. That I told myself I could stop it here, that this would be the last night, the last secret. But as his hand brushed mine in sleep, the lie settled heavy and familiar in my chest. That I turned toward him, watching the faint rhythm of his breath. He looked calm, content. I envied that peace. That I whispered to the dark. I told myself it was love. The words barely left my lips before the truth followed, silent but undeniable. That it already felt like a secret.